turn right around.
Yeah, that's all right. That's all right.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Business Law and Regulation and at the Case Western Reserve University School of Law, welcome to our event today on shale gas, climate change, and Ohio's economic opportunity. Dean Michael Scharf was going to be here this afternoon to welcome you all, but unfortunately he was not able to make it, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn the podium over to Alex Bosmosky, who is at the Energy and Enterprise Initiative at George Mason University, who is co-sponsoring our event today. So I'll turn it over to Alex.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody, and everybody that will be watching this in live webcast and tomorrow. We're really happy to be here at Energy and Enterprise Initiative. And today's event's called Shale Gas, Climate Change in Ohio's Economic Opportunity. And we have a distinguished and terrific panel to sort through some really important and politically relevant issues. We're a little bit of a odd duck in the environmental policy world. The Energy and Enterprise Initiative, we are free market, small government conservatives that are working on free market, small government answers to climate change. And we go around the country and talk to conservatives and students and business students and organize grassroots activities to help conservatives educate the public and correct the misconception that we don't care about the environment, which is a misconception. Not only do most conservatives care an awful lot about the environment, but we have some pretty good ideas to deal with it, ideas that are vastly superior economically to the environmental left. At least that's our position, and you can pepper the panelists with questions about that instead of me, if you want. So we have 5 folks here tonight that are each going to be discussing different angles on this broad topic, which is very relevant. I just want to point this out. You know, everyone's been watching the news with the Ukraine situation and Russia's energy bullying in Europe, and there's a lot of talk in the media and finally a lot of talk about how the American natural gas revolution can hamper Russia's ability to conduct their energy bullying in Europe. Not only are our natural gas resources the single most meaningful resource at our disposal to reduce greenhouse gases in the short term, but they also empower America's geopolitical situation. And so this conversation, I think, is particularly relevant given the recent events in Ukraine. So there'll be 4 15-minute talks, and then we will do questions. So please write down your questions, think about them, and in about an hour or so, or a little under, we'll be able to do a in-depth Q&A with our panel. Also, 2 other things, and then I will introduce everyone in order, so then I don't have to come up every time. Does that sound like a good idea? I'll just do everybody real quickly. 2 quick things. Firstly, who on here tweets? Is anyone? Are you guys Twitter heads or whatever people call them? No, really? Okay, a few people. Okay, and then on the webcast there'll be more, but we'll be tweeting and live tweeting because I'm a moderator, so I won't have things to do when people are talking. So I'm going to be tweeting from the Energy and Enterprise handle, which is @E&EI. And my handle is Alex Boz, and Bob's is Bob Inglis. Does anyone else want to shout out their Twitter handles? J Adler 1969. And we'll be tracking the conversation with the hashtag EcoRight, ECO Right. And we'll be very generous with the retweets and stuff. So if you guys want to engage with the conversation, ask questions via Twitter, I'll be here as your Twitter captain for the 4 of you that raised your hands and all the folks on the webcast. So up first, we will have Dr. Iryna Lendel. Dr. Lendel is the Assistant Director of the Center for Economic Development at Cleveland State University. She is an expert in energy policy, electricity markets, and best management practices for water use sectors. But she'll be talking a lot about Ohio's shale gas situation and opportunity. She was the principal investigator for a large study investigating the social and economic impacts of Utica Shale on Ohio's families and economy, and we're really, interested to find out about how the shale revolution is going to change the economic landscape in Ohio. Craig Butler is next. I'm going from the end in here. Craig Butler is the Assistant Policy Director for Energy, Agriculture, and the Environment in the Kasich administration. His primary responsibilities are promoting guidance and input to the governor on energy, agriculture, and environmental issues. Director of Ohio EPA. I'm sorry, Craig.
It's very recent.
Congratulations. And that's a cabinet level position. So we have a member of the governor's cabinet sitting here. We'll be looking forward to hearing about how Ohio is addressing the environmental questions surrounding fracking and natural gas, and how Republicans are dealing with it, how we should deal with it in a responsible, safe way. Juscelino Colares. I was having syllable trouble with Juscelino's first name. It's Brazilian, eh? Is a law professor and associate director of the Frederick International Law Center at Case. He's an expert on the law of international trade, climate change, and civil procedure, widely published around the world, and formerly clerked for the Chief Justice of the French Constitutional Court, and taught at a very famous university in Paris that I can't pronounce. So, could you pronounce it for me?
École normale supérieure.
Exactly. And next in line will be John Adler, so I'm skipping Bob for a second. John is a professor of law here at Case and the director of the Center for Business Law and Regulation. He's also a senior fellow at the Property Environment Research Center called PERC in Montana, which is an eco-right organization, and a prolific conservative blogger and writer, contributing editor for National Review Online, widely cited legal academic. Actually, I think he's one of the most cited legal academics in the world, and in 2007 was the most widely cited legal academic under the age of 40, which is crazy to me because you write so much other stuff that's not published in legal journals. I actually saw John sitting on a panel and turn out a 2-page blog entry on the panel. So somehow he can just write, and it's amazing. And we're very happy to also say that John is a advisory council member for the Energy and Enterprise Initiative. And finally, my boss, Bob Inglis. Bob is a former member of Congress from the reddest district in the reddest state in South Carolina. He represented South Carolina's 4th District as a Republican for 12 non-consecutive years. He was the chairman of the Energy and Environment Subcommittee on the Science Committee, also served on Foreign Relations, or Foreign Affairs. Bob, you're going to tell part of your story, so I'll just give you a little taste. Bob went to Antarctica a few times, saw that climate science posed some serious risks. Ultimately, that martyred him in the primary. And I found Bob a couple months later, and he was getting ready to start the Energy and Enterprise Initiative. So Bob is doubling down that conservatives have the answer on energy and climate, and I'm proud that he's my boss and colleague, and we're delighted to have everybody here. So with that extremely long series of introductions, we'll start with Dr. Lendel. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. I was a little bit sensitive today not to be called Iryna, because I'm Iryna, which is distinguished Russian name Iryna from Ukrainian name Iryna. However, I speak 2 languages, and my first education I completed in economics of oil and gas production in Moscow. Trust me, it's really close to my heart. I'm from Ukraine. I don't want you to have majority of your questions on the situation in Ukraine. It's very grim, but I can tell you it's very similar for many people like me who has friends on both sides and family on both sides. It's like Americans were cold fighting Canadians. So it's really awkward situation, first of all. A lot of this situation is based on the recent shale development in the world. And I used to say for the last year when I was asked to speak about the shale that two major news hit Russia in the past year. First was this asteroid or some stone that fell from the skies in the far east of Russia. And another one was that that very quarter when it happened, there was another news in Russia that overshadowed that cataclysm, and that was the decrease of Gazprom selling gas in Europe by 10%. So this is really shaking the world and geopolitics, as we can see that pretty soon US might come to the point where we might start exporting some hydrocarbons that we used to import. And as you can see, I'm true conservative because I'm saying we might, because I'm yet to see a really macro comprehensive analysis that will account not only for increases of the production of oil and natural gas, but also for the growth of the demand and consumption of natural gas, first of all within the country, and also accounting for the export of that to other countries, and have a component of geopolitics, because this is a card in this world to play always. But today I have way less ambitious plan, and I will talk about the study we completed and the point of view of economic development practitioner and academic, what this might mean for Ohio's economy. 2 years ago, when we started our study, on the left, this is how the map of Ohio looked like. And you can see the red dots were completed wells. So we really had 3 completed wells, and first was in the process of completion. At that point, we had a really scarce data, and we were talking to a lot of experts and people who came and had this experience in other states, such as Louisiana, Oklahoma, Texas, and neighboring Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania. And we were talking and assessing some data points that can be entered into our economic framework of thinking and modeling the data and trying to understand how the Utica will develop in Ohio. The map on the right is about 4 months old, and this is the growth of activity in terms of every dot stays for the well, and that's growth of activity we have right now in Ohio. And because I'm often targeted by journalists and asked for public speaking, I think people still desperately looking for good news and for more good news and more good news. I just want to say to people, calm down. We already have a good news. We have Utica Shale Reserve here. People see this as unfortunate that we have somewhat depressed natural gas prices and we are not pumping as much gas as we could have, and as of Marcellus in neighboring Pennsylvania did. But maybe that's a good news for Ohio. As an economic developer, I used to look at the fact and turn it from being a part of the negative asset or negative argument into something positive. Maybe it's good that we are not pumping out all our gas, because right now the technology is developing by the day. The couple of days ago, there was an announcement on advancement in developing the turbines for generators for the power plants that will burn natural gas more efficiently. And maybe we don't need to pipe the gas at such depressed prices and just add to a storage point. The winter a little bit ate up our storage gas, but it didn't push up prices so much yet. So there is a good news. We have Utica here. There's a couple of latest numbers just for you to understand that right now we have 300 actively producing horizontal wells and the number of vertical wells that are also producing. And this is very recent. This is as of February 1st, data released by Ohio Department of Natural Resources. We have overall more than 700 wells drilled. Just comparing this to numbers, you can see the proof that we are still catching in building midstream infrastructure, which are pipelines, gas plants that clean this gas, that gather it together and send it either to consumers if it's a methane, natural gas, dry gas, or to further development through the economy. We also, there's another number, Ohio Department of Natural Resources issued 1,000, almost 1,100 permits, which means we have 400 permits, which will be realized for sure within the 2 years, because this is the length of when the drilling should begin after the permit is issued. And we have 38 active rigs, and this is a very popular measure lately. What this measure alone doesn't tell you, that if you have a company like Ohio has, Chesapeake, where within the company you have economy of scale, where company has enough resources and own enough land and acreage to move these rigs very efficiently, the productivity of a single rig almost doubles compared with if it's a small or medium-sized company that have 2 or 3 rigs and operate and build 2 to 3 wells a year. So with 10 rigs, Chesapeake can build 30 wells in a year, while the smaller company with 2 rigs can build maybe 5 wells. So this is also what is behind of these numbers. Besides, we need to pay attention to Chesapeake. After all, this is the largest acreage holder in Ohio, leaseholder. They have the most rigs active. The company is very innovative on how it's developing and pushing forward its technology. We hope it will stay this way with change of leadership of company. I recently visited their water treatment plant, and I was impressed. I think they're on the right track. They're setting bar for the rest of the industry in Ohio, and I think this is a good company, and we are fortunate to have it. Now, the Chesapeake pledged to spend significant amount of money overall for shale development, which is about the $5.5 billion. And they are estimating that about 15% of that investment will be made in Utica shale development. This is a very impressive number. I will speed up a little bit from this point. I will talk a little bit about the framework, how if you want to think about Utica, that you can adopt, and that's how we thought 2 years ago, and how this framework evolved over this last 2 years from having actual development of Utica. When we just started, we understand that there are 3 components to this industry: upstream, midstream, and downstream. And we were at the very beginning of development of upstream segment of the industry, which is a lot of construction work. It's a lot of building a really capital-intense industry with a big injections of short-term projects with significant labor force. But this significant labor force might come, build the structures or wells, and will leave, and much fewer people will remain here. So we kind of had this understanding of this industry. We knew that pipelines development pace will rule how the development will happen in the region, in our state. And at that time, 2 years ago, the midstream was just in a very innocent state of development. And we decided at that point that we will model some data to understand what this development may mean for economy of Ohio. And we dealt with the data that we can really trust to the facts that we were obtaining. So leasing of mineral rights, we were extremely conservative. We believe that rest of the people in Ohio are like us. They would spend from 2 to 5% of this windfall of money from leases and royalties, and the rest they will save, which they are not, because I don't know how much you watch, but Ohio was a couple of times on the top list by selling the most expensive trucks and other cars. And I think yellow Corvettes are very popular in the southern Ohio. We did model the road construction and site preparation, drilling and completion phase of the development, and some post-production infrastructure, which included some gathering lines, not big gas lines, some gas plants, but we did not model the midstream oil infrastructure and some downstream opportunities. And we were, trust me, very extremely conservative. We were also extremely transparent in what we put in a model, and I think we gained a lot of respect from academic and practitioners community because we were transparent, unlike many other studies who promise hundreds and hundreds of thousands of employment, but don't tell you what assumptions they put under this estimates. So we spelled out all our assumptions, and these were the results of modeling that we derived from our study. And we were saying that if all our assumptions hold true, then by this year that we are now, 2014, the spending into the whole Utica footprint development might reach $6.4 billion. And again, we were very conservative. We account that this industry is not one of the main industries in the state of Ohio, and therefore does not have a lot of suppliers within the state. And by economic terms of economic impact, you model only you show only the part of the money from this investment, they stay within the state. So if you have your supply chain beyond the state of Ohio, you're giving money out. So we were interested to keep the money, to keep the economic impact within the state. Even with our conservative assumptions, we saw that we might have a potential to create and to support to about 65,000 of jobs. And I'm always very honest. Unfortunately, media always cut this because these details are very boring to them. These are not all new jobs, and we never said that, and we never say that. These are direct jobs that would be created. These are jobs that could have been lost if we wouldn't have had Utica. These are some additional paralegal that legal offices might hire to support their operations because they're getting more work done because of Utica. These are also indirect and induced employment. Indirect and induced employment is me as a professor at university having additional student whose parents receive royalties from Utica and have means to send that student to Ohio State or to Cleveland State or to Case Western. And the university is getting this extra tuition which trickle down through all this complicated system, and a little penny from that big tuition goes to my pocket as a professor. So this is all trickle-down effect through the economy that accounts for this 65,000 jobs. But it doesn't matter whether it's 10,000, 30,000, 65,000, just think about it's an opportunity to create jobs. Another thing that people heavily criticize often, if we talk that it's a good news, that it's hundreds and thousands of jobs that are coming, people don't understand that we talk about increased demand as economists. This is an opportunity. This is the job that will open. It depends on the people's Ohio skills and willingness to work maybe 6 days a week and 10 hours a day, and the pass drug test, the ability to pass this test, and ability to grab this job. But it's no guarantee that people will. So the State of Ohio Economic Development Agency should work and should help for people of Ohio to grab this job and realize this employment. This is just projected demand. However, I'll show you how to translate this data in something really meaningful for Ohio economy. Gross state product, GDP, is expected to increase 4.9 billion in this year due to development just Utica, which is even less than the oil and gas industry. This is an equivalent of 1% increase in the real value of Ohio total GDP. What is the 1% increase of GDP for all economy in Ohio? If you take the last 13 years, take off from these years, I believe 3 or 4 years when our GDP was declining, take off these years. Just leave only years that we were growing. Our average growth of GDP over the last 13 years was 0.6 percentage point in all economy, all industries. Utica, by very, very conservative estimates, might deliver growth of 1% just from Utica footprint. This is for you to assess and compare. 2 more points, and I will wrap up and let you write your questions. This point is often a little bit shallow. About when we started the Utica report, we finished a big report on steel industry in Ohio. And I think you should be really proud because this is extremely innovative industry. And you are wrong if you are still thinking of a dirty plants and really dangerous operation. I made a mistake. I went there in heely shoes one day in a Faircrest plant. There were barely dust on my shoes when I left the plant. It's a really high-tech, state-of-the-art operation on our steel plant. And if it would not be, then we will be very severely bitten and we will lose to China and Ukraine and many other countries from whom we import steel through the very port of Cleveland. So we must stay on the edge in the steel production, and our industry is. If you don't know, we are #2 state in the whole United States if we measure by the raw steel that is produced in the United States, and #3 just behind Indiana and Pennsylvania if you measure produced steel in GDP numbers. And our Ohio steel industry was the most growing in after Great Recessionary year, 2010 to 2011, of all 10 states that are leading in production of steel in the United States. Now, think as economic developer. If you have a successful industry that had the guts to rebound from this really horrific Great Depression, where the steel industry was as a forefront of decline, this industry is rebounding. It becomes smaller on average in the size of their business units. They adopt really strategies to use the competitive advantage and grow their production and to stay competitive in the world market, because the steel market is the world market. If you have right in your backyard another industry that is really capital intensive, that is full of steel pipes and steel structures and rigs and I don't know, everything there is from steel. And if you have this demand next door, and if you're a really growing and successful industry, that's a happy marriage. You're grabbing this opportunity, and our steel industry right on the target. The steel industry was growing not only from Utica shale development, it was growing from the overall US shale development because they had many orders before even Utica took off in a level that is taken off today. And I just want to take your attention to a very last point on this slide. When we look at the steel industry, steel industry is traditional industry for Ohio. So it has a lot of supply chain within the state of Ohio, which means if some orders for shale development are coming to our steel industry, that money is going to be spent on supplies for this industry within the state. So in 2010 alone, steel industry spent more than $10 billion for their supplies within the state of Ohio. And another point that was mentioned here, it's a cheaper electricity, cheaper energy for our industry, which is really a transitioning fuel from the coal-heavy power plant generation to renewables. Ideally, that's what we want to have, the cleanest. We are kind of in the middle of transitioning from one to another, and we need to take this opportunity because it does give additional competitive advantage to our industry, like steel industry, that are energy intensive. We have a lot of energy intensive industries that are base industries for Ohio, which means they exporting their product from Ohio, which they exporting product, they bringing money into the state and keeping it within the economy. We did some modeling comparing Ohio to 5 neighboring Midwest states that pooled the share of energy market, and we found that the increase of electricity price by 1 cent per kilowatt hour is likely to decrease on average manufacturing productivity by 2,500, which if you do a sensitivity study, that the 1% of increase of cost of electricity is going to decrease a productivity. It's not elastic, what economists say. It's not extremely responsive, but the relationship was statistically significant. So in turn, we can interpret it. If we have our electricity delivered cheaper to our manufacturing, then our productivity in manufacturing is growing, and this relationship. I want to turn your attention that quarterly, our college producing Ohio Utica Shale Gas Monitor, and I call this that this is the study for skeptics. You cannot believe my modeling. You cannot believe point of view of all experts that we interview to derive this data. This is monitor that is based on real, actual data of sale receipts. People who go and shop in those counties where the Utica is happening immediately, they spend their money, they pay sales tax. We gather this data and we show whether the sales receipts are higher within the counties with Utica compared to the control group. Again, I encourage you to read. It's on a website of Cleveland State. I have a lot of beautiful facts there that I won't bore you with. And this is the link to all our studies, study on steel industry, study on energy markets, study on Utica, and Shale Monitor. And I encourage you to visit it and have questions for me. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name's Craig Butler. Glad to be here. Alex, thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it. Jonathan, thank you for the invitation. Just as a bit of background in the introduction, Alex had introduced part of my last position, which was I was the governor's policy person on energy and environment and worked in the departments of EPA, natural resources, and public utilities. So this has been kind of near and dear to my heart for the last 3 years. I've recently was named by Governor Kasich to be director of EPA. And prior to that, I spent about 20 years at EPA, so it's a coming home of sorts, and I'm proud to be back. So what I thought I would like to be able to talk about, and it's going to dovetail well into Iryna, some of your remarks, and I got a few slides that are actually similar, so I'll blow through those pretty quickly, is this idea of why shale is important from the perspective from Governor Kasich, and why is it something that we have invested, in our opinion, a significant amount of resources, both intellectual and capital resources, to get prepared for this industry so that it can be successful in Ohio. And in short, I would say, let me see if I go this way. I boil it down to, people ask me this question a lot, and I boil it down to why is Ohio leading on energy, not just necessarily shale gas, but why we lead on energy. The first is, we have this abundant, diverse, cost-effective natural resources in the state. Whether it's coal or whether it's natural gas, there are even renewables that make sense in Ohio. How do you dovetail all of those together? People often think, maybe just because Governor Kasich is a Republican or otherwise, that he is, more toward fossil fuels than renewables. But I tell you, it's really more of an agnostic approach on energy, based on the fact that they be cost effective and that they can be competitive and that they aren't based on subsidy. The second is, we haven't had a comprehensive strategy for energy in the state of Ohio. We just haven't. I think administrations have written energy strategies for the state. They've tended to be very large documents that I don't think probably got a lot of read time after they were developed. We took a different approach, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then it's about shale gas and oil. This was a new emerging technology. It's a new emerging resource that the state has never seen. How do we factor that in, and what are the consequences going to be from a regulatory perspective that we need to be prepared for? How's it going to shape the markets, both economically and environmentally? And then last but not least, I would be remiss and say, and this is about as soft as I can make it, you're getting prepared for the increased federal regulatory pressure on coal and our coal burning industries in Ohio. So I'll hold this slide for just a minute, is shortly after I joined Governor Kasich on his staff, one of the series of discussions we had are what are the major issues that we need to be working on. And as you can imagine, when the governor comes in, there are literally dozens, if not hundreds. But what are the pillars, if you will, of core issues that we need to deal with? And deal with in terms of how do you get Ohio back on track? You've heard the governor talk about closing the $8 billion budget gap that we had, having 350,000 people out of work. How do we do that? What are the pillars? What are the strengths that we rely on to help Ohio get refocused and recentered? And one of those was energy. And that had matriculated into this concept of we wanted to do an energy summit. And while we didn't do it here, we did it at Ohio State, the Ohio State University. And I'm an OU guy, so that really is troubling for me too. But we had some friends. We worked with President Gee, and we did it at the Student Center, the new Student Center, which is a fabulous facility, an international energy summit. And really, I'm going to take you to the end of this. And really, what that was is we used that as the basis for development of our comprehensive energy strategy. And it really relied on, I call it the 10 pillars of what our energy policy was. And I could stand here and spend probably an hour or so on each one of these, but I won't. I'm going to talk very briefly about number one, which is shale, and how we got prepared for and how we continue to work in the space for shale and shale development. I thought I'd take one step back, and this dovetails with Iryna's remarks about just hydrologic fracturing. This is all about, there's a lot of hyperbole, misinformation about what hydraulic fracturing is, how long it's been around, whether it's been successful, whether it's contaminating groundwater. So I like to use this slide. And you see in the picture there two friends of mine. One is Jim Zeringer on the left, who's director at the Department of Natural Resources, and on the right, the chief of the Division of Oil and Gas, Rick Simmers. Rick is just a very impressive guy. He's been with the department for, I think, close to 30 years in the oil and gas industry. So he has been a stalwart for us in understanding this. And Jim's a great guy in terms of, he's just got a lot of experience in this field as well. But we talk about hydraulic fracturing as not being a new process. It's been used in Ohio since the 50s. We've fracked over 80,000 wells in Ohio and more than 1 million across the country. And there's this issue about whether you're going to contaminate groundwater. And I underline this. We've even had US EPA administrators testify in front of Congress that there are no cases of groundwater contamination related to hydrologic fracturing in Ohio. It just has not happened. In terms of a graphic, this is an often used from Ohio Shale Info graphic just about the process, not only about the well casing that is used, but the fracturing process. I will direct you to, let me see, I'm going to go ahead and then come back. I'm going to direct you to a YouTube video that was produced actually by our friends at the Department of Natural Resources. They've got a great video. If you ever need a video or a visual taking you through the hydraulic fracturing process, that is a great video to follow. And what we're talking about is something that is really unique to the state of Ohio. We've had an oil and gas industry for over 100 years in the state. It pales in terms of size as well as scale, in terms of what this new industry is. This is a typical drill rig site of a Utica, Point Pleasant, Marcellus type hydraulic fracturing operation. It's about that there. That is about each well costs in excess of $6 million or more to drill. That's each well. They're now putting somewhere in the neighborhood of somewhere between 10 and as many as 17 wells on a well pad, which is what we call here, requiring somewhere between 4 and 6 acres apiece. So they are quite large, and compared to our traditional industry that might need a half an acre, it is a significant departure. So you can see where we started to need to look at how we were going to have to change our regulatory system in Ohio to be prepared for this, so that we made sure that we did it right. If you're just kind of getting your feet wet a little bit about Utica, Point Pleasant Shale, this is generally the area in the state, although I would say at this point this graphic's a little old, and as you start seeing the southeastern quadrant, which is now still white, I think you start seeing a migration down into southeast Ohio. And it's a progression in the color scheme from east to west, and you see it where natural gas liquids moving towards oil. This is all a function of geology, in that we've got to the south and east much deeper geology resources for the shale in Point Pleasant. It's had more time to cook, as they say, and at 9,000 feet under intense pressure you get more natural gas. As you get closer to the surface in Morrow County, Delaware County, you're seeing the Utica in the neighborhood of maybe 3,000 feet. You don't have the pressure. Hasn't been there as long in terms of being able to cook the hydrocarbons. You get more of an oil type of play there. There are even outcroppings at the surface of Utica and the Point Pleasant Marcellus. So you've heard of Utica, Ohio, and even it's the first place we discovered natural gas in the state, all the way in the western part in Findlay. That was drilled into the actual Utica and Point Pleasant formation. So it's been around a long time. We've known this has been here a long time. It's the technology that has allowed us to unlock this, and that's that horizontal drilling practice. So right now we are seeing lots of additional activity and shale activity, and there's a graphic that I'll use that Iryna had here in just a moment to talk about the counties where we are seeing shale activity. I use this as a way to talk about two things. There's a lot of activity going on in a lot of counties. They call it the exploration phase. The industry comes in, they're kind of poking around, they're building a drill pad, they're putting one drill in, fracturing that, getting the results, doing the analysis, trying to figure out, if you will, where along that continuum, where it's most prolific, if they're searching for dry gas, if they're searching for natural gas liquids, they're searching for oil, just where they position themselves. So there's a lot of exploration and production, even though this new industry is several years old. I think it's generally still emerging and still in a relative infancy, except for the counties I've got in red. Carroll, Columbiana, Harrison, Jefferson, I would term those into full production. You're seeing well pads built, you're seeing multiple drills put on a pad, and from the graphics that you've seen already, and then I'll show you here just in a second, they are in full-blown production in those, not only because they've tracked down the resource, but the infrastructure is in place to be able to move that asset, pipelines and other fractionation processing facilities. Iryna touched on this. We've gone quite significantly in terms of drilled, permitted, and producing wells. Just parenthetically, when we held the Energy Summit, for example, when we did that in September, we had one well drilled. None were producing. So you can see just how quickly we've moved in the industry. This is the rig count, the active rig count. We are up to 37, which is an increase from where we were even in May of 13. You can see where they generally are positioned. The technology is advancing so quickly where they took 30 days or more to drill a well. We're down in the neighborhood of probably under 17, probably getting closer to 15 in terms of the time that it takes for them to spud the well and actually get it drilled, and then be able to move over however many feet they do it and put the next well in. So production, the art of production in terms of drilling, the dance that is done is how quickly can you get the infrastructure built to move the gas off the well pad, because you can drill a lot faster than you can put pipelines in. So this is, and you're spending $6 to $10 million to not just drill a well, but you're spending several other $1 million to build the well pad, the infrastructure to get there. You can strand a lot of money. You can drill a lot of wells before you actually get the infrastructure there to deal with it. And this looks like the graphic that you recently saw. This is, you can see in that corridor where it's most heavily populated, those are generally where the 4 counties are that I think we've kind of emerged into full production and out of exploration. Couple of spots on numbers. We did, one of the changes we made on a legislative front to get ourselves ready for this, we started asking for data quarterly about production, not on an annual basis, but this was 2012, our last annual production numbers. We saw about 635,000 barrels of oil produced, and that's a significant increase from what we had seen. In terms of natural gas production, it's about 1.2 BCF of gas, or billion cubic feet of gas, which numbers you can find, and we track these as all public data on the well and oil and gas well production report that we now have online. Those numbers are orders of magnitude higher than what they had been in our traditional industry. And I will use an example here. These 2 wells are not our most prolific in the state, either for oil or gas, but at the time I think that they were when I actually put this together. But there's a Buell well that's owned by Chesapeake. It's in Harrison County. It's mainly a gas well, and you can see both the gas production and how many days it was in production. 7,000 MCF of gas per day, 7,500 MCF of gas per day. And then the Brookfield is mainly, it was an Anadarko well. That's a very, not much in terms of gas, but in terms of oil, it's about 475 barrels a day. So if I just take a second and look at oil and gas production, we've got about 49,000 oil and gas wells that are still registered in the state of Ohio, still producing some gas, some as little as 10 MCF a day, or a traditional kind of stripper well. But if you look at the Buell well, and that 7,694 MCF per day of gas is, that one well is 2% of the total gas output for 2012. So that's just a sense of how the scale that we've got. So one of the thoughts that we had, this idea of pillar of energy and how shale was going to reshape the landscape in terms of energy in the state of Ohio is, we took a quick look at this and said, yes, we've got oil and gas in Ohio for 100 years. It's a completely different animal. Our regulatory system is not set up to embrace this industry. We want it to work. We want it to be successful. So we've got to do some significant changes. We put all this together in Senate Bill 315, which is a manifestation of the energy strategy and the regulatory change. Relative to shale, we wanted it to include lessons learned from other states. Ariana, you mentioned talking with Oklahoma, Texas. We were probably right on your heels talking to Oklahoma, Texas, North Dakota, and our friends in Pennsylvania about, not from an economic standpoint, but from a regulatory perspective. My analogy is sometimes it's not best to be first. This is one of those. There's a lot of lessons that we learned. They were very generous with their time as well as their advice about making sure their number one piece of advice to those states that were not used to this is, particularly North Dakota and even Pennsylvania, where I'm from. They said, get your regulatory house in order. You're not going to be able to keep up with this industry, but you have to try. You have to make sure that you get your regulations put in place so that this is done safely. So the key attributes, I think, of 315, that Senate Bill 315, which was the bill that we passed 2 General Assemblies ago. One, at the time, it was all about this issue about chemical disclosure, the chemical disclosure of hydraulic fracturing fluid. Ohio, I will still say Ohio has the most comprehensive law in the country about how we manage hydraulic fracturing fluid and the disclosure of the chemicals that are used in hydraulic fracturing fluid. Because not only does it account for chemicals that are used in the drilling and the fracturing phase, but if you lose the mechanical integrity of a well at any time during its lifetime, any chemicals used during that to either shut that well down or bring it back into productive life, all are disclosed not only to us, but independently through the Frac Focus website, which is all public information. We also, you can drill a well, but you got to move the gas, pipelines. Our pipelines, the gathering lines, the small lines from well pads to the interstate lines, those of yesterday are not the gathering lines of today, and I will talk a little more about that, as well as the increased liability for insurance for horizontal wells. Just a quick second about roads and road use and maintenance agreements. One of the local concerns that we knew and we wanted to deal with was, you're taking 1,000 truck trips to do a well pad. And some of our local roads just are not in a position to handle that. We've got narrow roadways and challenges. And Ohio's a home rule state, so this is a challenge for us. How do you make that work? And what we put together is a road use and maintenance agreement so that local townships and the oil and gas companies could work together to find a solution for that. And this is just an economic impact of that, where we're seeing as much as $50 million invested in Carroll County for road development. And you can see the others there. And the result is this. You're seeing on the right-hand side, which was once a fairly nicely gravel road, and on the left you see where that road has been paved. This is presenting some challenges in and of itself that I won't talk about today, such as just maintaining those and providing resources and maintaining those, but we recognized early on that roads were an issue. I talked about gathering lines, and I'll fix a little more about processing lines, but the gathering lines are basically those small lines that take gas from the well pad, connect those into the interstate transmission lines, or taking it to what we call fractionators and processors. We knew we needed to fix that from a regulated standpoint because a gathering line of yesterday, as I'll call it, was something that was under 9 inches in outside diameter and less than 125 pounds per square inch. A gathering line of today is like a transmission line of yesterday. It can be an operating internal pressure of over 1,000 psi. It can be 24 or even 30 inches in size. So we knew that we couldn't regulate it through the Public Utilities Commission like that, so we put on the right-hand side, you'll see the requirements that we put in place to make sure that our pipelines that were going in were safe, as well as they were marked, as that there were damage prevention and corrosion programs put in place for those gathering lines that they're being put in to service this industry. Now I've got another slide that is kind of interesting of all of the pipelines in Ohio, but you basically can't see the map of Ohio if you do that. So these are pipelines that we are seeing expanded, modified, or completely new pipelines to service this industry. So you're seeing the orange and kind of pink lines through the northern part of the state. Those are generally moving gas and or natural gas liquids to Sarnia, Ontario, where they've got a natural gas cracker. You're seeing the Rockies Express line down at the bottom, the blue one, which was the major line that talked about moving natural gas east. They're converting that line and turning it around. So there is literally billions of dollars that they're putting in pipeline installations to take to these facilities that you never would have ever seen built in Ohio. For example, in the tiny little town of Cadiz, where they're investing billions of dollars to process the gas so that we can see that invested. A few of the companies that are benefiting from shale activity, and this is a very few downstream, as well as recent investments in terms of from the oil and gas production side of things. I'm going to mention two things in terms of keeping up with the industry. We're not done yet. As I say, we can't let down our guard. We have to continue focusing on a couple of different issues, such as directional drilling and impacts that we're seeing to some of our waterways and wetlands. And another recurring issue, this is about technologically enhanced naturally occurring radioactive material, or TNORM, and the process that we have recently put in place to make sure materials that come out of the ground that have this TNORM enhanced radioactivity material are managed appropriately or recycled. And plugging orphan wells. I'll just mention one thing about plugging orphan wells. This is something that's near and dear to Speaker Batchelder's heart, and it's something that we're talking about right now in House Bill 375, which is the updating of our severance tax. And I will only mention very modestly that we're working closely with the legislature to try to get the legislature to update our severance tax, because right now the severance tax in Ohio is, for a barrel of oil, it's 20 cents. And for 1,000 feet of, or an MCF of gas, it's 20 cents. Or 3 cents, excuse me. So for the type of industry that we're looking at here, we just want to be able to right-size it. We don't want to overtax the industry, but we want it to be fair. So my final thought is this. We're continuing really to adapt to this industry as it matures, not only from an environmental perspective, but from an energy as well as an economic policy. Ohio, I believe in this, I've heard this said, we recognize that we're a really comprehensive, collaborative approach, and it is providing low-cost, reliable energies for manufacturing, as Iryna said. We're going to continue to realize significant benefits, and we think it's going to help, obviously, make our long-term goal for global competitiveness for the state of Ohio. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Juscelino Colares. I'm a Brazilian-born U.S. citizen. Alex forgot to mention that part. A colleague of John Adler here at Case Western Reserve School of Law. I write on international trade and climate change issues, and I am thrilled to be with you this afternoon to discuss the contribution of shale gas production, the contribution that shale gas production has made in the United States and can make abroad in the context of climate change, of the climate change problem. I will try to focus my discussion on three brief points. First, how natural gas development has benefited the United States in economic and climate change terms. Second, how further natural gas development in the United States can benefit the U.S. and other nations by serving as a bridge fuel that can further displace coal and other high heat-forcing greenhouse gases. And third, finally, I would like to make a policy and legal suggestion, export liberalization, that would truly amplify the positive contribution that natural gas has already made in terms of the economy-wide contribution and also in terms of the climate change mitigation, while also advancing U.S. National and also Ohio's interests. So let me begin by talking about the benefits so far. The current boom in shale gas production has helped make the United States one of the world's most energy self-sufficient countries in the world. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Energy Security Index currently ranks the United States the 6th most secure among the largest 25 energy-consuming countries. The 5 countries with the least continuous access to affordable energy resources are Ukraine, in the news these days, with the worst country, Thailand, South Korea, the Netherlands, and India. Right? With perhaps the exception of the Ukraine, all of these other countries are U.S. allies. And of course, we know that the situation in the Ukraine is evolving, and it is definitely, these are definitely countries that need and that rely and will rely on continued U.S. support on energy policy, and especially if the United States becomes, and as the United States becomes the world's a powerhouse in natural gas that will rival Russia. Development of shale based natural gas deposits increased domestic production by over 30% in the period 2006-2013. With this increase, domestic prices are far below those overseas. Gas prices in the UK, to give you an idea, are more than double those at the Henry Hub in Louisiana, and near triple that in Japan. So the Japanese consumer pays at least 3 times what the US consumer pays at this moment. And Japan is also the world's largest importer of liquefied natural gas. Natural gas needs to be liquefied, compressed at very, cold temperatures so that it can be shipped overseas. In almost the same period, from 2007 to 13, U.S. greenhouse gas emissions fell by almost, following this, development of the natural gas industry. U.S. Greenhouse gas emissions fell by almost 13%, perhaps the biggest decline among industrial countries. At present, the U.S. consumes 9% less energy for each dollar of GDP than it did 6 years ago. 9% less energy for each dollar of GDP than it did 6 years ago. The United States is also becoming one of the most energy efficient countries in the world, which should really help. Granted, not all of this carbon efficiency and energy efficiency is due to the shale boom. It is true also that the Great Recession and the slow recovery, economic recovery, same thing occurring in Europe, depressed energy use in the time. However, the price of energy, market-driven technological advancements, and the gradual impact of EPA emissions regulations have created strong market pressure for greater energy and carbon efficiency. Natural gas's fortune is that it has delivered on these 3 fronts: price, technology, and lower emissions, estimated at about 50% of total emissions from producing and burning coal. Earlier in the aughts, higher energy prices influenced investment in hydraulic fracturing. Greater investment in newer fracking technologies led to the resource's greater supply, which in turn led to a fall in prices. Low natural gas prices encouraged power companies to switch to a lower emission fuel, gas replacing coal. This seems to be a good moment then to switch to a discussion of natural gas as a bridge fuel. Most environmental groups will remain vehemently opposed to shale development, in some cases due to the fault of bad apples in the industry. Other groups recognize the environmental benefits of encouraging greater use of natural gas to replace coal. The Environmental Defense Fund, for instance, while pressing the industry to reduce methane leakage, methane is unburned natural gas. Natural gas and methane is the same thing, CH4. And so methane leakage from wells and pipelines is a problem, right? Especially, and it especially happens at the moment of extraction and in the pipelines at the moment the gas is pumped. It accounts for the 50%, of emissions, equivalent emissions from coal. Methane, it should be said, is about 25% more heat forcing than carbon dioxide. But even accounting for that, if you account for the leaks, it's some new studies have come out and have where they have argued that it may not be 50%, but this is an issue that the industry can easily address. First, methane is what the industry produces. The industry has a vested interest at reducing leakage because it can sell more gas, right? Second, the cost of those reductions is minimum. It's 1 cent per million cubic feet of methane produced. So it's something that the industry can do at some point, or at this point, it can start doing it. The state of Colorado, 2 weeks ago, passed the first law in the country that requires methane reduction in methane emissions at gas wells. And the Environmental Defense Fund, the same organization that, is fully behind the industry, helped Colorado draft the law. And that law is likely to become a model, and that's something that the industry can easily implement at very low cost. So what are the benefits then, one might say, if gas is still a fossil fuel, right? First, there's the 50% less emissions argument. But then what really makes natural gas stand out as a bridge fuel is that abundant natural gas encourages power generators not only to switch from burning coal to burning gas, but also to build electric boilers that can absorb eventual surplus wind or solar production. As the cost of emission rises and renewable fuels become more competitive, the ability to integrate these fuels in gas-fired plants is very attractive. Second, current wind turbines are built to generate energy whenever there is wind. When there is an oversupply, this is the current technology on wind production. When there is an oversupply of energy on the power grid, the windmills must be shut down. Well, when demand for energy picks up and wind power is not yet on the line or cannot meet demand because perhaps it's not windy enough, the ready availability of gas is ideal. It's easily stored. So gas is a bridge fuel in at least two directions. It helps open the way for integrating renewable fuels into the grid in a seamless way, while it moves in to address fluctuations in energy throughput from wind and solar sources. So there's a clear case to be made for these advantages of natural gas. I move now to talk about briefly, hopefully briefly, about the export argument, which is really something that I've written on before. Unlike ordinary exports, natural gas exports of gas in the United States are subject to a quite Byzantine system of export permitting. If you're trying to export some, books or steel beams to other countries, you basically do the deal with the party in the other country. In the United States, you have to obtain a license from two agencies, the Department of Energy and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. The regulations simplify licensing to so-called free trade area countries with which we have free trade agreements. At the same time, those exports to those countries are assumed to be in the public interest. So there's not, it's an automatic approval. However, if you're trying to export natural gas to a non-free trade area country, you need to establish why that export would be in the public interest. The process for determining that is fairly elaborate and extremely lengthy. In the past 2 years, for example, the Energy Department has approved 23 of 25 applications for LNG exports, liquefied natural gas exports to free trade area countries, while approving only 6 of the 19 non-FTA free trade area country export requests. It took, for example, Cheniere Energy Sabine Pass liquefaction non-FTA application 29 months to win approval. Operations of LNG export terminals undergo other complex administrative hurdles to ensure compliance with other environmental statutes. There is talk in Congress right now about revising this regulatory scheme, revising the Energy Policy Act, and making the process for exports more seamless. There are, of course, good legal reasons to reduce current restrictions on these exports. The United States is a WTO member. As a member of the WTO, the U.S. is committed to a number of obligations, including GATT Article 11, which comes with a prohibition against adopting quantitative restrictions against imports or exports, and in this case, exports. Our trade partners may soon argue current U.S. law and regulations prescribe an export permitting system that has effectively restricted the volume of liquefied natural gas exports by imposing on potential exporters a lengthy, protracted permitting process amounting to an export license that is expressly prescribed under Article 11 of GATT. Discretionary or non-automatic licensing schemes have been overruled by 2 prior WTO decisions. Japan Semiconductors, that of course was in the semiconductors case, and India Agricultural, Textile, and Industrial Products, which involved import licensing on a number of products. Setting vague criteria to determine whether exports are allowed gives licensing agencies unfettered or undefined discretion to reject a license application, a finding that led a WTO panel to hold China's export licensing regime for raw materials incompatible under Article 11. The United States was one of the countries that complained, that were featured as complainant in that case. So one would expect a WTO complaint to target the current public interest criterion for authorizing gas exports to non-FTA countries as similarly opaque and thus in violation of WTO law. So also, more recently, the United States has won another case against China involving restrictions to exports on rare earths, and using the same Article 11 GATT argument. So there is absolutely no legal ground for the United States to continue with the current law and regulatory scheme, and we may actually be at some point taken to the WTO. But more important than that, and it's not only the situation in Ukraine, if we are defending a particular position at the WTO in favor of free trade, right? And if we are actually making use of these international agreements, the GATT in this case, to actually cause the Chinese to reverse their policies, we cannot be holding the same policies that the Chinese, or similar policies the Chinese currently have. Of course, the policy or the legal argument is a little bit more complicated to make, but that's the legal argument. And the policy argument, especially given the current events, is even more important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you, Bob and Alex, for suggesting this program. And I want to talk very briefly about the tremendous opportunity that shale gas presents and the tremendous challenge that climate change presents, and how we should think about these together. Gas, as we've already heard, is a cleaner and cheaper fuel that presents tremendous economic opportunities. And climate change, many suggested, is the greatest environmental challenge that the world currently faces. And as some folks have already mentioned, gas can play an important role in helping us deal with the problem of climate change, but we should also be quite clear about the scale of the problem that we're facing, and not try and convince ourselves that gas by itself is the solution or the only solution, because it's not. The stated goal of the United States in terms of greenhouse gases is to reduce our emissions 80% below 2005 levels by the year 2050. Gas, under ideal circumstances, can reduce greenhouse gases from electricity production by about 50%. And that's making some assumptions about leakage and the like that may or may not be justified. So it can make an important contribution, but it can't get us there by itself, even in the sectors of the economy where it can play the greatest role. And to get a sense of the challenge we're talking about, just think for a second about what 80% reductions in greenhouse gases means. That means reducing greenhouse gas emissions to a point we haven't seen in this country in a century. It means having the greenhouse gas emissions we had in approximately 1910, when there were only 92 million people in this country, when per capita income was about $6,200. But of course, in the year 2050, we're not going to have 92 million people in the United States. We're probably going to have somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 million. So in per capita terms, we need to figure out how to get greenhouse gas emissions to where they were during Reconstruction. That is a daunting challenge. It's something that, frankly, we don't really quite know how to do. It's greenhouse gas emissions, net greenhouse gas emissions on the order of 2.4 tons per year per person. That's less than half per capita what we see in a country like France that relies on nuclear power to a far greater extent than we do now, and a far greater extent than we probably ever will. We're looking at per capita emissions of countries like Grenada or Botswana.
It's 99% in France.
Yeah. So that's a percentage of nuclear use we will never see, and we can compare ourselves to countries like Switzerland, which again use hydro to a level we don't use, and in fact we're actually reducing our hydro capacity in this country, and that's not even taking into account the fact that population density in places like France and Switzerland make them a really poor comparison if we're looking at energy use. The challenge is magnified by the fact that the demand for energy and electricity use worldwide is increasing, and rightfully so. There are millions of people around the world that would love to have just a fraction of the energy available to them that we do here. And again, gas can certainly play a role if many of those countries can learn to take advantage of natural gas resources in place of coal, rather than developing coal, or rather than using the wood and dung that are often used for heating in homes and the like. That certainly avoids a lot of greenhouse gases that would otherwise go into the atmosphere. But it's not enough. Gas plays a role, but no matter what our assumptions are, we know that if we're going to deal with greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we need a tremendous amount of innovation. And I think, fortunately, the history of natural gas development in this country actually tells us a lot about innovation in the energy sector and the sorts of policies we need to be thinking about if we want to have a hope of having the sort of innovation we're going to need to deal with climate change as a problem. Because again, as I already mentioned, we place all the coal burning in the United States with natural gas. Tomorrow, we optimistically reduce the emissions from electricity generation by half, but overall, that's an approximately 15% reduction of the U.S.'s total greenhouse gas emissions. Nowhere near what we need to go, where we need to go. But if we look at what's happened with shale gas, one thing we see is an industry where there has been a tremendous amount of innovation in a relatively short amount of time. And as Tom Merrill of Columbia University noted in a talk here last year, it's worth asking why this occurred, and in particular, why this occurred in the United States. Because there are shale gas deposits all over the world. And yet this innovation, this development occurred here. And it occurred here far more rapidly and more dramatically than anyone anticipated. Why is that? Well, Tom suggested a few variables that were in play here, which I think are important. One, he noted that the United States has, from the standpoint of a property owner, a fairly generous approach to mineral rights. Our default is that if you own the surface, you own what's beneath the surface. That both creates an incentive to figure out how to do something valuable with what's beneath the surface. It also creates an incentive to use that in a responsible manner. And that's quite different than what we see in most of the world. From an institutional standpoint, it also means that control of mineral resources is quite decentralized. It doesn't take a central decision at a central governmental agency to decide what should be developed, how, and when. But rather, if one guy down in Texas who's a bit idiosyncratic, who's been chasing the white whale of being able to combine fracturing and directional drilling for decades, finally figures out how to make it work, he can actually make something of that. And that is, in fact, what happened. It really was a handful of people who believed, contrary to what the experts were telling them, that there was a way to unlock these seams of gas and to do so profitably. And it wasn't because a central agency said, this is the way you're going to develop your gas and oil resources. It wasn't because they were funded at a government lab to do it. It was because they saw an opportunity, and because of private mineral resources and relatively decentralized control, they had the opportunity to pursue that. We've also had, and we heard some of this from Craig Butler shortly, or just a few moments ago, a fairly decentralized regulation of oil and gas development in this country, which means different jurisdictions have been able to try different things and to learn from their mistakes. And certainly, although Ohio has the admirable record of not having any groundwater contamination from hydraulic fracturing, and the record with hydraulic fracturing has actually been in this country quite good, there still have been mistakes. But there's been an opportunity to learn from those mistakes. Jurisdictions to learn from each other to both maximize the potential to capture the economic benefits of this development, as well as to allow for innovation, and then learn from those that have adopted regulatory measures or liability rules to maximize the benefits of this development without being subjected to extreme costs. And again, this hasn't been the result of centralized governmental direction. It hasn't been the result of federal government telling us, again, how we would develop these resources, how we would regulate them, how they control them, but rather a decentralized process that allowed us to learn as we did it, which has enabled us to have this tremendous development, but also development that's been regulated in many ways far more efficiently than a lot of what we see in many other environmental areas. So why is this relevant for climate? Well, because we need innovation. And we know to get innovation, we need a system that encourages innovation in a decentralized way. Because that's where innovation comes from. Innovation doesn't come from putting the smartest people together in the biggest lab with the biggest government grant. My apologies to some of my colleagues across campus. It comes from lots of different people trying lots of different things and ensuring that they are able to capture the benefits of those things. ensuring that they can have the freedom to innovate and experiment, but also the ability to capture the benefits. And that's something that is easy to do when we're talking about producing something that's on your property. It's more difficult when we're talking about technology, particularly when we're talking about environmental technology, but it's something that we certainly can do. And for those that are interested or that need help sleeping, I have like a 60-page article that talks about the history of technology inducement prizes and how that it can be a model for encouraging innovation by creating dramatic rewards for solving really pressing problems. Problems that, for a variety of reasons that I won't go into for time reasons, that the patent system alone is insufficient to do, because when we're talking about the global atmosphere, we're talking about a commons where the gains from innovation cannot be fully captured by the innovator, and so there is a role for the government to fill that gap. We also, though, need to look at the way we regulate. There's been some mention of wind, and I used to live downtown and wondered if before I left the warehouse district, I would have the benefit, the opportunity to see wind turbines on Lake Erie. Well, I left before they were there, and they're still not there. There's still not a lot of places when we're talking about the United States. In 2002, the folks that were trying to develop the Cape Wind project off the coast of Massachusetts were told by the federal government that they should have all the permits they need in 18 months. The most recent federal court decision in the litigation over the various permits and approvals that Cape Wind needs was earlier this year. It is over a decade later, and we still don't have the first offshore wind development up and running in the United States. That's not a way to encourage investment. That's not a way to encourage the diffusion and deployment of technologies that we need and that we will learn from. And while I agree with NASA's James Hansen that we should also not fool ourselves into thinking that renewables can fully provide our electricity needs in the foreseeable future, they cannot. They certainly have an important role to play. And if what we want to be doing is encouraging innovation, the last thing we want to do is have a regulatory system that says to someone that's trying to invest in these sorts of technologies, we'll tell you you can operate in 18 months, and we'll still be telling you that over 10 years later. Because while the Cape Wind folks may not have given up, surely there are many other investors in similar sorts of projects that look at that experience and say, that's not for us. That it's a lot easier to make money in the United States pursuing a lot of other types of developments than it is clean energy. So Shale, in closing, let me just simply say or one last point I should just make, that if we recognize that innovation is our goal, and we need to not only recognize that decentralized discovery is essential for that, as it has been with shale gas, but that both centralized funding and centralized regulation has had a poor track record at trying to encourage the sorts of innovation that we need. The cap and trade system for sulfur dioxide, for example, those limits were not based on technology forcing. They were based on what we already knew the industry was capable of doing, and it turned out that most of the reductions resulted from transportation deregulation because it became so much cheaper to transport low sulfur coal across the United States, not from people developing cleaner and better scrubbers. California first thought it could mandate a fleet of electric cars 20 years ago, and they're really still waiting. Regulation is not going to get us the sort of innovation we need either. We need to look at the lessons that we've seen from shale gas development and realize that decentralized innovation and a freedom to innovate and discover are the things that we need if we're going to be able to solve the climate problem. And so while we recognize that shale gas has an important role to play as a bridge fuel as we try and deal with climate change, we should also recognize that the same things that enabled us to take advantage of the shale gas revolution are the sorts of things we're going to need if we're going to successfully deal with the challenge of climate change. Thank you.
Wow, what an exciting time to be in Ohio. You know, you may wonder why it is that the Energy and Enterprise Initiative wanted to pair with our advisor here, John Adler, in doing this kind of thing. Well, it's because Ohio is proving really the exciting times in energy and the transformation that's occurring that you've just heard about. And I guess my role here is to talk a little bit about the politics that will change as a result of that. because, you know, politics usually are sort of a lagging indicator. You've heard the smart money so far. Now the politician or the ex-politician rises to tell you about how politics eventually will catch up. We'll get the memo about the change that's happening. And the change is really a danger and an opportunity. As I understand it, I don't speak or write or read Mandarin, but as I understand it, the word crisis in Mandarin is written with two characters. One means danger and the other means opportunity. And that's what I think, what I would summarize what we've just heard here, is it is a danger and an opportunity. You may be here, and we'll get ready to have your questions and comments here. You may be here thinking there's a danger in having fracking going on in Ohio, and you heard some admission of that we do have to be careful about escaping gas and that sort of thing. So you may be thinking that, but you may also have become acquainted with the study that says $4.6 billion increase in GDP here in Ohio. That's pretty impressive. And so you have a danger, you get an opportunity. And we think at the Energy and Enterprise Initiative that really what this shows, what you're bearing witness to here in Ohio, is the proof of the thing that we're trying to establish, especially among conservatives across the United States, is that free enterprise can deliver innovation faster than government mandates or fickle tax incentives could ever dream of. And that what you got to do is just unleash the power of that free enterprise to answer these challenges and to deliver the innovation that John was just talking about. So what you have here is a guy in Texas named George Mitchell and some others who had the ingenuity to figure out how to combine, as John was just saying, directional drilling and fracking to produce an increase in supply that resulted in a declining price, that resulted in substitution of better technology. So for example, in my home state of South Carolina right now, 6 coal-fired plants are being converted to natural gas. And the people of South Carolina are breathing a lot better because we're getting not only better greenhouse gas emission situation, but we're also getting less particulates in the air. And so our healthcare costs will be going down. Recent study out from MIT singled out Ohio for some bad news, speaking of danger and opportunity. The bad news is you have one of the highest mortality rates from small particulates from coal-fired electricity. People are dying in Ohio because of the socializing of soot. And so what we're here to say as substance first, before I get into politics, is what an idea to say to those that are getting away with socializing soot, you can't do that anymore. You got to be accountable for the stuff that you put in the air. So be accountable. Account for it, put it in the price of your product, and then let's watch the free enterprise system sort that out. Now that's a danger and opportunity, right? There's an opportunity to clean up the air that immediately presents a danger if you're here maybe from the coal industry or have a friend or family member in the coal business. Danger, right? Because I think several years ago, I'm not sure what it is right now, but about 65% of your electricity comes from coal, and there may be something like 2,500 jobs or something like that in coal mining. It's danger for those folks, right? Because their commodity is being revealed for some of its cost. And the free enterprise system is about to judge that fairly harshly compared, for example, to your other product, which is natural gas. And as I just said, in South Carolina, we're no longer a customer at 6 plants for coal, some of which might have come from Ohio. We're now buying your natural gas. So there's danger there, there's an opportunity, right? And here's now about the politics, and then we'll move hopefully quickly to your questions and comments. You know, I had the opportunity, what we do at the Energy and Enterprise Initiative is go around engaging mostly with conservative audiences. So I spent a lot of time with college Republicans. I'm going to be with Case Western's college Republicans tomorrow morning for breakfast. We spend a lot of time at Federalist societies at law schools, energy clubs at business schools, basically trying to lift the veil on this so that we can see beyond the current state of affairs to the future, where the politics really will turn around on this. And so during the school year, I have plenty of opportunities to go around talking, you know, but in the summer, not so many opportunities. So we do some Boys State. And I want you to know that a couple of summers ago, I went to Kentucky to speak to Kentucky Boys State. This is an American Legion program for rising seniors, high school seniors. And so I got there, and I didn't realize exactly where I was going, but I got there and found out that this was Muhlenberg County. You know the song, Daddy, won't you take me down by the Green River? You know, and so sure enough, I got to give my talk about how we're going to innovate, we're going to put all the cost in, we're going to eliminate all the subsidies, we're going to watch free enterprise deliver all this innovation. There's a guy with his arms across his chest like this at the back of the room. And he says to me, first question was from him, do you know you're in coal country, son? Second question was from him. Third question was from him. Finally, thank goodness the organizer cut him off and said, listen, let's let the boys ask the questions rather than you. So later I met him in the hallway. And, you know, I thought this could be dangerous to meet the guy in the hallway. But fascinating discussion about the turn that's happening there. You know, I said to him, okay, listen, let's stipulate climate change is hooey. And he said, oh, no, I don't think it's total hooey. I said, no, let's stipulate for a moment that it's total hooey. Still, you want to do the tax swap that we're talking about. Reduce taxes on some form of income, shift the tax onto CO2 so that you don't grow the government at all, but you do untax things you want more of, and you put a tax on things you want less of. And he was sort of beginning to be open to that idea, but I said, listen, those just assume that climate change is hooey. He went on to tell me, though, that the coal from Muhlenberg County isn't burned there. It's shipped west and on to China. And the same empty coal trains bring back our coal from out west, and it's burned in Kentucky because it's cleaner. And so we talked a little bit then about how, but when they're burning it in China, it comes around. And so this guy that had been cross-chested was starting to realize the danger that he's exposed to, and perhaps the opportunity, but it's harder for him to see opportunity because he's right in the middle of coal country. The difference for you in Ohio, and the reason it's so exciting to be here, is yes, you've got coal, but you got this natural gas. And so the lagging indicator I'm saying about politics and the fact that politicians sometimes get the memo pretty late is you wonder when will politicians, particularly of my party, a Republican Party, start realizing that there may actually be more jobs in natural gas than there are in coal. And if I may go very political for a moment, the type of people involved in that and the kind of enterprise that they're used to may be quite different. And their politics may be quite different. So that natural gas folks may actually be wildcatter, free enterprise entrepreneurial types. Coal may be very different political stripe. And so at some point, my party may realize, why was it again we were hugging up with coal? Why aren't we moving on to the new? Why aren't we innovating? Why aren't we saying, this is great, and it proves our message that markets deliver really exciting innovation. If you just put all the cost in on all the fuels, eliminate all the subsidies, and then watch the free enterprise system solve this thing. So that's why I'm excited to be here in Ohio. Ohio is proving it right now with the innovation that you're using and deploying here. I just wish for the topic that John and I spend a fair amount of time talking about, climate change, I just wish that Craig does not join me in this wish, but I just wish that there were a Cuyahoga River to catch fire when it comes to climate change. I know that Craig does not wish for that, but you know, it was the Cuyahoga River catching fire that gave us the Clean Water Act. The challenge with climate change is there's no Cuyahoga River to catch fire. And so we just are the frog in the pot of water that turns into frog soup because we don't realize how hot it's getting. Hard to say that this winter, isn't it? But we all know that that has to do with variations and weather, not climate. But look forward to your questions and comments about this exciting opportunity, the danger and the opportunity here in Ohio, and the proving ground that Ohio is for the innovation that we want to see at the Energy and Enterprise Initiative. Alex, you're doing the questions, right?
Sure. I think these microphones work, hey? Let's, we can pass them, or, I'll pass you up one, sir.
Okay.
If you want to come
I
down.
want to know, what is your observation about the procedures called fracking and mountaintop removal? And this last weekend, there was I perceived to be a little upheaval in Washington regarding 400 people being arrested for the XL pipeline. Within the context of climate change and regulation, what are your observations, and what do you see in the future for these procedures, fracking, mountaintop removal, and the provocative issue of the XL pipeline within the context of climate change and regulation?
We should split that up into a couple different ones here. What kind of coal mining do you do in actual mining in Ohio? Maybe Craig can answer that. And I guess the Enbridge pipelines are probably more relevant than Keystone here, but if anyone wants to make a observation on the climate impacts of improving the efficiency of how we transport oil through KXL, that would probably be appropriate to answer the gentleman's question. Thanks.
I will say I'm not an expert on the Ohio coal industry, but I do deal with it a fair amount from the regulatory perspective. But we do have a mix of both underground mining and surface mining. We do not have mountaintop removal mining in Ohio. So surface mining is generally restricted to kind of contour surface mining. Ohio does have about 2,500 coal mining jobs in Ohio. Somewhere in the neighborhood, I think, of about 25 million tons per year. The significant majority of that is from one system of underground mines in Belmont County. So there are some other fairly significant surface mining operations, but it's predominantly underground mining in eastern Ohio.
Thanks. KXL?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. I mean, I think in thinking about something like Keystone, the question we have to ask is compared to what? That is to say, what is the world going to look like with it? What's the world going to look like without it? And there certainly are reasons to believe that the pipeline itself does not result in the burning of fuels that would not get burnt otherwise. It just primarily has the effect of changing where they're going to be burned. And it has a big effect on how it's transported. And how it's transported matters both from an energy use standpoint, which has climate effects, as well as it matters as well for other sorts of environmental impacts. If the alternatives are transporting it by rail, for example, I don't know if anyone here is from the railroad industry. That's not something that I would encourage. I think one thing that's about Keystone XL, and I have mixed feelings on whether or not it's should be has become the giant symbol that it's become. But one thing I also think that hasn't been discussed enough with it is the way it's been cited and the like. I think that when we're dealing with pipelines or any sort of infrastructure like that, not enough attention is paid to how the routes are determined and what happens to the landowners that are in the way, and are they Are they willing sellers or not? Are they being sufficiently compensated if eminent domain is being used? I think that's one aspect of, personally at least, that with KXL that has not gotten nearly enough attention. There certainly are some areas along the route where it's not clear that the rights of landowners were sufficiently respected. So those are just a few comments on that.
I just want to add one thing, because I think what Greg did mention, that Ohio is still coal importing state. We're not self-sufficient in coal. And the other thing which really kind of caught my attention and was sort of as an oil and gas half engineer, a little bit offensive, a comparison of removal of the top of the mountain with the fracturing process. So I think people who comparing this should a little bit educate themselves and just to learn a little bit of complexity and state-of-the-art technology that is used during the fracturing, and the amount of engineering thought that is put in that, and the amount of protection that is developed around of the technology process. And any technological process, when we start changing the product, is invasive to the nature. So we are doing a lot to make this less invasive as possible. And I think as of now, this is really can't be compared with so invasive way of removal of mountains as we have now.
Just like to say one final thing. I remember reading some time ago that the extracting oil from tar sands is not economically feasible if the barrel of crude is less than $60. The barrel of crude has been, above or around $100 for a long time now, or some time now. So it is, economically feasible to do so. It remains economically feasible to do so because the market price is that high. The market price still, as Bob said, does not fully capture the true cost of the resource, the true social cost of what results from the burning of that fuel. If we had a carbon tax that was revenue neutral, meaning that the government wouldn't use the carbon tax to basically give money to other purposes, to purposes other than to offset the effect in the economy of that new tax. I would highly doubt that that price would go up, and it would be less over time, not only for tar sands, but for any oil. It would be less interesting for people in the private sector to continue going in the direction of oil. But unfortunately, this is not where we are at the moment. And that is where I think there is an enormous area of overlap between people who are on the left, who would favor a carbon tax based on their reactions to the climate change problem, and people who are on the right who basically see it as a clear problem of markets not currently pricing in the true cost of the product. And that's something that, we shouldn't let politics, we shouldn't have to wait, but you can't do things, you can't change things without politics.
I got one broader point, which really also on energy generally. If our goal is to get away from certain fuels, ultimately that only is going to happen if there are alternatives that are economically viable on their own. If one pays attention to what's been going on in Europe with subsidies for renewables, one looks at the rate, for example, of permitting of new coal plants in Germany, a country that's supposed to be environmental leader, and how aggressive they are in terms of permitting new coal plants because they want cheaper energy. One realizes that that the way you get away from fuels that you don't want to use is not by trying to plug up those holes and prevent those fuels from coming to market. It's making sure there's a viable alternative. And that's true in the United States, it's true in Europe, and it's even more true in developing countries. The world's appetite for energy is so great, and will be for all of our lifetimes, that where we do not focus nearly enough effort is figuring out how to make the volume of energy that is needed truly competitive with the sorts of energy forces that we need. And it's difficult to do. It's kind of sobering to think of what all is required, but in the long run, that's the only way it's going to happen. There is yet to be a single country that has effectively decarbonized as a process or as a result of deliberate policy choice. And it's because of the fundamental underlying economics. And that's what we have to really pay attention to.
So I made eyes with 7 questioners in the last 2 minutes. So I think we should bundle a little bit. So let's do 3, and then I'll note them down, and we'll distribute them, deal with them, and then do the next, another 3 to maybe make this go a little faster, if that's okay. Sir?
Okay. This is a little bit more focused, but I understand one of the key challenges of fracking is what do you do with the water? How much do you need to do the fracking, and once you frack, what do you do with the water? And I was curious as to whether the panel, in particular Craig or others, had a view on whether water disposal issues or the costs associated with that will serve as a constraint on the amount of recoverable reserves we'll have in Ohio, and then extended if you have a view on other parts of the country that have less water than we do.
Yeah. And will Rick Schneider give you a diversion for all the extra frack water we might need? Michigan has tended to veto all new diversions of the Great Lakes. That's a terrific question. Thank you, sir. And I'll run up here.
Thank you. First, Northeast Ohio has already had its first offshore wind turbine. First in the U.S., and possibly the world, was not far into the lake in the late 19th century. But having said that, my question is that given the extent to which externalities are not reflected in current pricing in general of energy and of shale gas in particular, what's known about the economic effects of the, for example, health impacts on real estate values, a variety of other things? What you described were the impacts that were most easily captured with available statistics, particularly from the industry, tax revenues, for example. And related to that is the fact that this is a transformational source of energy because of its volume and because of its lower price. And so the task of forecasting economic impacts is particularly difficult because the existing economic structure is a very poor guide to anticipating the impacts in the new regime, and I believe your study used existing structure rather trying to anticipate the new structure.
Who did I give number 3 to? No, I don't. You were not number 3. Were you? I thought you were 6.
Might have been number 4.
Okay, number 4 then. You speak up. Thanks.
Sure. I would like to ask about methane leakage.
Sorry for the video.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about methane leakage, and what I'd like to say is the best estimates from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association right now are that if the leakage of methane were to exceed 2% from drilling and transporting gas methane, that this would make it a worse source of energy for the climate than coal. I know that I believe Professor Colares spoke about this a bit, said that the company fixing this problem is quite easy, and that there's a great motivation to. So the Colorado, for instance, passed regulations recently that would reduce their emissions by about 50%. But the current regulations, according to the most recent estimate in Colorado, are nearly 9% of this gas that's leaking, which means, as an energy source, it's still quite a bit worse for the climate than coal.
I think we got the question, unless you had a second part.
Sort of 1.5 part. As I understand it, part of what makes gas so appealing is the fact that it can be drilled quite cheaply now, thanks to this fracking technology. If that's the case, isn't it, barring some sort of very, very strict regulations that may or may not be feasible, isn't it really in the company's interests to drill as much as they can, let a fair amount of it leak, but try and get as much to market, not being good for the climate at all? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I'm going to weigh in on that one just real quick. Because a lot of companies are switching to reduced emissions completions for the reason that Dr. Colares discussed. And the 9% figures on leakage from these individual studies, the flyover studies, are outliers, just like the ones that say there aren't any leakage are outliers. And most of them have been concentrating between 1 and 1.5%. The interesting thing that you brought up about how companies might want to just frack and frack and frack and then sell regardless of leakage, it's really expensive, and you have to frack wells much more frequently than conventional wells. So they're constantly drying up and building new ones, and you want to suck every ounce of shale gas out of those wells. Otherwise, you keep having to drill the multitude more, and it becomes uneconomic. So there's just, I think that, I'm sure that Craig can weigh in more.
I'd speak to it in a couple of different directions. One, there's been some discussion about the Colorado, the new recent rules passed. They did an announcement a few months ago, and I think just as of maybe last week, they did an announcement of the rules that they're going to implement for leak detection. So Ohio has been working, and there was other discussion about working with an Environmental Defense Fund. We have worked, and it's been, I give them a lot of credit. It's an organization that we found very able to work with from a state perspective on many number of issues, and this issue about leak detection is one of those. They have been able to come in and talk to us about the Colorado model. We have are nearing completion of some modification of rules that we have that we think will slightly different approach, but we think will be as, if not more effective than what Colorado has recently done relative to rules that we'll put in place for leak detection at the site, as well as being able to make sure that those repairs are made. The other comment I will make, and Ohio is quite a bit different, I think, perhaps than than North Dakota in this respect, in that, and it's often talked about that they flare a lot of gas in the North Dakota oil fields because it's not cost effective for them, in their opinion, to capture that gas while they're focusing on mainly an oil play. Ohio's got an intriguing rule. It's called an anti-wasting rule, where and it's coupled with another state law that says you have to maximize the resource. So, as a company is submitting an application for a drill plan per se, is where they're going to drill. Part of the assessment is not just on the technology of that to make sure it's environmentally friendly, but the Department of Natural Resources is obligated by law to make sure that as they do the well spacing, that they maximize the capitalization of that resource, that you can't leave it behind. So couple that with the idea of an anti-wasting law. If somebody were to come to Ohio and they do this, you have to actually, from a technological perspective, once you drill that well, once you fracture that well, you have to prepare that well to actually flow gas. You do that through a modest amount of flaring. We allow that in very certain circumstances for a very short period of time, but we're actually prevented from allowing them to do that for month and month and month on end, much like that you see going on in North Dakota, because of the anti-wasting law. So we'll do it as few as 10 days that we'll give an opportunity to flare a well. before that they actually have to put that well, either cap it because the infrastructure isn't there and hold that investment, or actually put that well into production.
Craig, do you want to speak at all to the water question?
Yeah, I would. I appreciate that question. In my view, this industry lives and dies by water. Not only in terms of availability of water, I think you're seeing estimates continue to be in the range of somewhere between $3 and $5 million, depending on how long your laterals are to actually fracture a well. There are opportunities to reuse that water. There are opportunities to recycle that water. There are opportunities to, once that water is no longer usable, what do you do with it? That's a question. Movement of water is very expensive. It's heavy. And it's just unwieldy in terms of how you mechanically do that. So it's obviously just a complex and vexing problem. Whether it's in Ohio, like a state in Ohio, where we've got more than enough, an abundance of water, or whether it would be in a state perhaps like Texas or Oklahoma, where water is a much more scarce resource. We don't want to see anybody waste that resource. So I guess I would answer it in a couple different ways. On the one hand, if you look, I'm going to go backwards. So from a disposal perspective, Ohio is exceptionally fortunate. But we don't rely on this, or as we say, you don't whistle past the graveyard and rely on this as your only source of management of water that can't be recycled is underground injection. We've got a network of almost 200 underground injection wells in the state that have been permitted under the auspices of Department of Natural Resources and US EPA to basically lock up this water from where it once came. So that is a network that we think is not only safe but effective. We think it, first and foremost, though, you got to recycle this water. What we recently passed in the legislature is some opportunities, some structures to allow companies to recycle this water. So we're seeing innovation take the marketplace over and develop solutions about recycling of the water that are used. More exciting to me is some really technologies that we're seeing used in Ohio. We're seeing them much like, I think, the perfection and maturation of the drilling process. We're seeing the drilling or the maturation of the fracturing process, getting away from water completely. So you're seeing some interesting ideas of using CO2, coupling the idea of carbon capture sequestration, being able to use that for enhanced oil recovery, being able to use that for hydraulic fracturing. You're seeing new technologies emerge where you're seeing liquid natural gas or propane as the fracturing material, which is, I think it's got some challenges in terms of technology, in terms of safety, but you're not introducing water into the environment, which does in some cases have a plugging effect in the well, but you're introducing liquefied natural gas or propane, which frankly, that's what's coming out of the well anyway. So once you depressurize it, it's basically coming back to the surface, leaving the sand and propane behind to keep the fractures open. So I think there's a lot of new emerging technologies. I think this whole industry, frankly, not only in terms of this development of the Utica resource, but you look in terms of historical context and emerging of the technology, the whole industry is in its infancy. We're seeing, as I mentioned before, drilling a well time come from 35 days down to maybe 17 in less than 5 years. So what does that portend for the advancement of the technology on all of these fronts? I think the marketplace is driving, as long as the price supports it, the market is driving this innovation for it to be not only more efficient, but more environmentally protective.
Thank you. Dr. Lendel, did you want to weigh in?
Thank you. And I completely agree with the statement that the current price doesn't reflect the social cost of hydrocarbons. And I will have my answer in two areas. The first of all, we dealt with that in our study by being extremely conservative in calculating what you call an easy or calculatable or accessible economic impact. So we know we are conservative. We know that true economic impact is greater, but that was our way to say, well, we don't want just to show this hundreds and thousands of jobs, knowing that we are not accounting for all costs that should be accounted. So this is the one way to say it, but the second way is what you're talking is primarily about the social impact that these developments are doing. And in Ohio in particular, it's remote and often rural areas. And what we've seen in these areas is a lot of disruption of the life of people. And it's not only through heavy trucking, because the companies are also innovating and dealing with that by, for example, having a flexible freshwater piping. Instead of trucking the water, they just pipe the water from basin to basin. And but what we see that the small communities with, and I have some data in my other presentation, but some communities with as large population base as 1,000 people have influx of temporary workers, and sometimes as big as 4,000 people. So they're running short not only of rents and temporary housing, but they really have a severe impact on their infrastructure. Again, economic question, is it feasible to build this additional infrastructure if we know that we will have this short influx of really large temporary workers and primarily non-Ohio workers, and those will leave and we will be left with this infrastructure. So I think that Ohio is evolving. This week, we're about to start another big study for the state of Ohio that will show the roadmap of footprint of Utica development in terms of midstream and downstream industries. We want to see how much was in parallel building all these wonderful pipelines, how much the product will stay within Ohio, and we can rely on this continuous economic effect and build this all necessary infrastructure, and will not hit the problem of the boom-bust cycles where we build infrastructure and that is emptying out, and we are left with unnecessary resources spent. We do have some responses within Ohio where companies are working directly with communities by mitigating some of the social impacts that are not captured. And one, I think Greg mentioned in this contracts with communities on the road maintenance. This is the one way to deal with this. I think the governor proposing the increase of tax of the industry, where, as I read, 10% of that would be designated to the counties that experiences this enormous social impact and the community impact, and they might be helped from the state level to mitigate these consequences. And I will tell you that we're also learning from other states and neighboring Pennsylvania how they dealt with these problems in terms of schools. When you have these people that work here on a temporary basis, but they move from place to place. They work 3 weeks in one place, and then they move 60 miles away, and they work 3 weeks in another place. And their kids might bring their families here, and that's what Pennsylvania saw. And they, because these temporary workers are often Spanish-speaking families, they bring their kids to Ohio schools somewhere in Cadiz, where there is nobody who speaks Spanish at the school, or scarcity of such resources. The other interesting problem is you have drilling crews or pipeline construction crews which are predominantly young male crews in an age where they might drink after work and I don't know, sing aloud, and they have one sheriff for several communities cruising in a single car. And this sheriff is left with some warrants coming from other states. And so technically there is no resources on a local level often to deal with the social issues that are accompanying this development. And I think these communities are reaching out for help. Our college has the program where we teach these communities how to plant, and there are more severe than this anecdotal issues that I mentioned, because there is also a planning codes that these communities neither have in place or have resources to develop. And when companies come in and asking for extensive construction and other problems, they might not have mapped infrastructure or code in place for this for these places that are desired to companies. So I think this is outstanding problem. I haven't seen, again, as you know, the solving the problem starts with the good study and assessment. I believe Ohio University just released a first survey of communities, and they asked the government officials and leaders what are the problems these communities are facing. And I think if we study first and see what we should deal with, we will find a solution both with help of government and private sector.
I'll add on to that. I'll just add one shameless input for our severance tax. Ariana's right. We have recognized, since we've been talking about this, that one of the factors, and this is where we learned from North Dakota, Pennsylvania, is this idea of, I call it local impacts, beyond just roads and infrastructure. So we had been working with the Speaker in the House on House Bill 375 and the severance tax, but we're trying to get a substantial portion of that money directed back locally, and we've really developed a framework, and the percentages will get worked out hopefully, but it's somewhere more than in the neighborhood above 10%. But we're really trying to do two things with this. First is, we have some things put in place through the current tax structure or the road use and maintenance agreement to work on the immediate infrastructure needs. What we really need to build is a bridge on long-term infrastructure, whether it's roads or parenthetically bridges or other types of infrastructure just from the industry itself. And third, how do we build a legacy fund? And I say this, how do you say, 5 generations from me, will we look back and say from an extraction industry perspective that Eastern Ohio is left better than it otherwise would have been because this industry was here? So we've developed this framework. We've got this in the bill. So I think it's a real departure from where we have been. I think it's a real step forward. Now that we've got that structure in place, it's just how do you maximize the ability to dedicate resources to attack some of these local needs that frankly we don't know if they're temporal or long-term, but ultimately we know that they're there, and we know that those communities are having a disproportionate impact, both positively in some cases from sales tax receipts, but also negatively from some of these social impacts, to be able to address that.
If I can jump in, Craig, to follow on that, is to ask, since we're talking about local impacts, some of which are maybe positive, some of which may be negative, could you share a little bit about the perspective of the state or the state's position on the litigation about whether or not ODNR permitting should preempt local regulation, and how dealing with local effects fits into that from the state's perspective?
Without acronyms, if
Without
possible.
acronyms, yeah.
State regulation preempting local regulation.
Yeah, I think I could do that pretty quick. The Supreme Court recently heard a case in Ohio, and there's some other litigation I think ongoing in Pennsylvania. It's slightly different. As you know, Ohio's a home rule state, but Ohio also has that was probably in the past 10 or 15 years. State statute was changed so that the Department of Natural Resources has something that is, a sole and exclusive authority. And you hear that sole and exclusive authority used a lot. The DNR, except for, frankly, programs like Ohio EPA, where I've got a federally delegated program where they need an air permit per se. Anything other than that, the Department of Natural Resources in statute says that they are the primary and sole regulatory agency for oil and gas. That has what is under challenge right now is this idea that responsibility preempts local decision-making relative to whether or not, frankly, any community, and there have been several that have challenged this idea, either it's a community, a township, or a county, some other governmental entity at a local level could say, no, we don't want this. We want to decide, in a home rule perspective, we want to decide if we would like to see a windmill in my backyard, if we would like to see oil and gas development, hydroelectric fracturing, oil and gas. So that is what is currently at stake. I think I will say it this way, what I think the benefit of the sole exclusive authority has done is allows from a regulatory perspective and frankly from an economic development perspective and from a business security perspective shows the industry that there is at least a stable regulatory landscape. And so I think that is a positive. What I think the proponents often say is that this takes away my right at my local level to decide how I want to have my community structured. That's in front of the Supreme Court, and I suppose we'll hear about that later this summer.
Okay, so thank you, Craig. Bobby, there's we're gonna.
There's the response that I need to give to that gentleman.
There is the response that you need to give that to the gentleman. I'm sorry.
Yes. Yes, methane is 21 times more heat forcing than carbon dioxide. And the way you do to account for methane, the methane contribution in the overall U.S. greenhouse gas emissions is to basically, you multiply the amount of emissions of methane estimated times that 21 number so that you normalize, you can compare the two. The Environmental Defense Fund came out with a report yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, that said, that basically calculated that the industry could reduce about 40% of its methane emissions at very little cost. I mentioned some figures before. As we stand right now, the natural gas industry in the United States is responsible for only 9% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not really a major problem, a major challenge. There is also the need to look at the problem not only from the perspective of the gas company at the well, or the distributing company, the gas company, or the distributing company, but also as a problem of failure of regulation on the part of state utility regulators that have in the past, and up until now actually, allowed the amount of gas that, the difference between how much gas is sent out versus how much gas is metered at the point of consumption, they have allowed the power company to actually charge for that difference. It's actually responsible for 3% of the gas bills of DC. I know one place where it's like that, DC. 3% of your gas bill is because because the state is lost, and the state is actually charging it to the consumer. So you need to definitely remove that so that you basically force the externality not on the consumer but on the distributing company, the power company. But that's not a gas industry problem. It's a failure of regulation.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that DC had that. It's a unique approach. Bobby.
Several states have it.
Several, really.
So pretty briefly on the carbon taxes, first, if we're talking about privatizing more of the social costs of carbon, are we also talking about privatizing more of the social benefits and surplus from energy production? Because, you know, if you were willing to do the latter, maybe people would be a little bit more excited about doing the former. And the second is that in 1604, the King of England wrote a pretty prescient document saying that this tiny crop that was being imported into England from the American colonies was bad for your health. And accompany that with an impost on tobacco, and the immediate consequence in the near term, at least according to me and probably no one else, was that the tobacco industry boomed incredibly over the succeeding generations until the mid-20th century. So how do we guard against a tax on carbon increasing carbon or preventing the lessening of carbon consumption?
I was going to say, we've had this conversation a lot. I'm not convinced that every governmental tax results in other governmental efforts to subsidize what's being taxed. I think it depends on a lot of things. I think we're a long way from that, and I think that we should watch closely things like what's going on in British Columbia, where they adopted a revenue-neutral carbon tax that displaced a significant portion of other taxes, and we're able to implement that in something like a tenth of the time it took the EPA to create a cap-and-trade system for 800 utilities. And so they were able to deal with far more sources, have a much broader program, but administratively far more quickly, far easier for the government to implement, far less exposed to sort of rent-seeking that you see in regulatory processes. If it turns out that doesn't result in reduction in carbon emissions in British Columbia, that would be important information to have. Given what else we know about sensitivity of energy use to prices, I would be very skeptical if that were the result.
And let me say, your contention is that perhaps the government would like to continue use of fossil fuels so they could continue to collect the revenue?
Right, yeah, so local governments that actually get tax revenue directly from fracking in the Marcellus, Utica, and Devonian shales have imposed almost no bans, and local governments that don't get any revenue from fracking have been banning it, like 16% of land area in upstate New York. So seems to be some sort of connection there.
Yeah, interesting. Well, it does take, it's interesting. I mentioned the Boise State and Kentucky. I did the same thing at Boise State, West Virginia, where I told them, in South Carolina, we used to think that tobacco was a product that we could count on. But society, after a long period of time, decided that they were no longer interested in subsidizing the production of the crop, but they were also trying to kill through an advertising campaign. And so the government decided to get out of the business of subsidizing tobacco, and there were big changes to that industry. And then the other example I used for them was textiles. When I was in Congress the first time, and John Kasich was the chairman of the Budget Committee, and I was on the committee, but that really made me sort of a guy that benefited from all John's good work. We claim credit for everything good John did, the rest of us on the committee. But in that first 6 years, you could almost see a chance of domestic content legislation for textiles. But then time went on, and when I came back to Congress after a 6-year hiatus, that was gone. There was no chance of domestic content legislation for textiles because people had decided they liked the idea of cheaper clothes. And so our textile industry in South Carolina went under the bus. And so what I was saying to the boys in West Virginia and Kentucky is, get ready for coal going under the bus. Because if society decides that it doesn't want to breathe that stuff anymore, it will go under the bus. But your contention may be that their benefit. I mean, if that happens, if it happened in tobacco and arguably happened in textiles, because in textiles we were collecting tariffs on those goods, we gave that up. The government gave that up. So I don't know. I don't see us holding on to for example, coal. When this MIT study out recently shows that people die 10 years prematurely because of coal soot. I think that we're probably going to wise up to that. The thing that's harder though is when you have something that's tobacco is harder because there's some things about how it is that we personally continue to use something even though we know is damaging, but that also, I guess, is contrary to your observation because we are actually having state governments try to reduce the demand for tobacco even though they benefit from the tobacco tax. So I don't know, there's several, I can see your point, but in the case of fracking, but on the other hand, in the case of tobacco and textiles, I'm seeing the opposite, where the government actually was hurting its revenue stream.
And Bob, maybe people wanted cheaper clothes. People want cheaper energy too. And right now that feels like it's just keeping the costs out of fossil fuels. But in reality, the cheapest energy, that we will ultimately, and everyone I'm sure wants this, is abundant, cheap energy. There's a 400 quadrillion megawatt thermonuclear reactor in the sky. And eventually, it powers everything from these fossil fuels we have to everything. Eventually, people are going to want their free energy, and we'll get there, but you can't, there's the discontinuity with the current trends. Finally, you, in the blue.
Yeah, so real estate-based question. So I was recently reading and comparing average parcel sizes in the Marcellus Shale area versus like the Bakken Shale area, where you could have like a 30-acre parcel size in Ohio versus like a 300-acre parcel size in North Dakota. And that has, in my mind, it has pretty interesting effects on ultimately, it has to come down to the cost of withdrawing natural gas from, less efficient real estate allotments in Ohio versus, for that matter, more efficient real estate allotments in North Dakota. And at least on a couple of different levels. For example, if a pad is 5 acres, and you need to put that on somebody's 30-acre plot, suddenly if 1/6 of his area is completely wiped out because there's a big cement block there, right? So at some point that has to ultimately push back into dollars per whatever amount of natural gas. So at some point the Marcellus Shale has to be less cost efficient to withdraw than the Bakken Shale. Curious about how those implications then funnel down on whether it's the real estate negotiations or ultimately if there's any cost pegs that the panel knows about and could provide insight in towards.
I wish my friend Tim Fitzgerald from Montana State were here, because he's done a lot of work on the Bakken and done a lot of work, talking with landmen about the deals they make. But I think if without having his data, one of the things that I think he does talk about is how quickly those that stand to profit from these arrangements on both sides learn to increase the efficiency of the negotiations, but in terms of ensuring they get what they want. And so you see things, for example, dramatic changes in the contracts and the information asymmetries that may exist the first time somebody shows up asking, disappear relatively quickly, but also figuring out how do you assemble, because you don't just want the space on the surface. If you're dealing with an underground resource, you want to make sure you're assembling that as well. And if you can make sure that the drilling that you're doing is going to go a longer distance, you need to make sure, especially outside of Texas, and there's some interesting legal decisions there that make it a more interesting case of late. You want to make sure you can develop as much of the deposit as possible from as little surface area as possible. And my own sense from talking to him is that the industry is fairly efficient at figuring out how to overcome those and reduce those transaction costs. And if there are places where they have a hard time doing that, well, then that probably tells us something. And if it's difficult for them to do that in certain places, then maybe those are places that we should be less aggressive or less desirous of seeing the development take place. And I'm not, certainly for myself, I don't think that they need really government assistance or help in facilitating that process.
I guess I'd answer a little bit in the same line, but from a different perspective. So nowhere in Ohio are you going to see them get a permit or actually do a drilling unit within something less than 640 acres. Because that's the minimum size that you're going to need. So to see something on a 30-acre parcel, it's just not going to happen. So we're seeing a minimum 640-acre footprint. Most likely, we're seeing unitization sizes of twice that for a application that'll come in. I think one of the awakenings that you saw as not only the technology advanced, but as it marched eastward from Texas and Oklahoma, where you could go and get, through talking with one rancher per se, or one large one owner of property in the neighborhood of 20, 30, 50,000 acres with one, to working in the East Coast, Midwest, where you see very small parcel sizes, and the need to go out and execute leases. Not only that were very small parcel sizes and need to combine those units in a way that fits the geology underground, because you just can't go out and say, I got 1,000 acres. It may not work for you depending on the orientation of how the geology works and how you're going to do your drilling. So it's an art and a science, and I think you see the need that has actually slowed the development process a bit until they understand how they can work in the environment here in the East Coast, where you've got many, 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 many property owners that you're trying to knit together, and then how to manage the idea that, for example, say I've got a 1,000-acre block that I want to put into a unit, or a 640-acre block that I want to put into the unit, and say that I've got a few last remaining stragglers and pockets in there. How do I handle that? Ohio's got some laws relative to what they call unitization that allow if you get 65% of an acreage put together into a unit, you can't get some of the remaining property owners. You can go in front of the Technical Advisory Board, the Oil and Gas Commission, make an argument to say I've made my best faith effort, and then they may unitize that. So if you're unitized and you're a property owner and you haven't actually leased your mineral rights, what's that mean? That means that you will now be subject to the lease that others are being subject to. You'll get the royalties from that, but you won't get the upfront bonus payments, which can be significant. Somewhere probably approaching over $6,000 or $7,000 an acre in some of our more prolific areas. So I think the challenge there is this is like an attorney's dream in Eastern Ohio. Not only just the litigation issues relative to unitization and whether, but the idea that we've done oil and gas development in Ohio for 100 years on all of these small vertical parts of property, understanding and trying to figure out the fractional ownership of who just the heck owns the mineral rights is absolutely daunting. And we've gone through this personally at the state level, just trying to figure out in all of our Eastern Ohio assets, who owns the mineral rights? Were they given to us by the federal government? Did we purchase some? Were they donated? Do we not own them? Do we know we don't own them? It's an absolute nightmare to figure that out. And so landmen and others are, you hear the nightmares of them scouring the counties and working in the books 24 hours a day. That's what they're primarily doing, trying to figure out, number one, who owns the mineral rights so they know who to go talk to, and then two, how to figure out to assemble a unit in a size big enough to accommodate the horizontal drilling technology that they got there.
Did I promise anyone else a question? Because we're gonna have to make this the last one. If I didn't. Super.
Great. Thank you all so much for your time and your remarks. My question has to do with the idea of decarbonization, and if, regardless of the social costs as they currently stand, if the idea is the status quo is really cheaper. Looking at both energy and transport as the two highest sectors of carbon emissions. In energy, for example, you see First Energy, the largest investor-owned utility in the nation, actively pushing back on standing legislation for energy efficiency, which is actually the cheapest energy by far. When we use less of it, we're using less capacity on the grid, and it makes it cheaper. And you see industrial, the Manufacturers Association in Ohio is totally for this. So it's really energy companies versus everybody else on that front. In transportation, we know that in the last 10 years alone, $50 billion has been put into the Highway Trust Fund, which is more than we've put into Amtrak over the entire existence that we've had it. So I really question the idea of subsidizing renewables or subsidizing the clean aspects when we have about a century's worth of subsidies being piled into oil and gas and fossil using infrastructure, and it's still actually not necessarily cheaper than the clean options today, let alone with a carbon tax.
I'll say, I support doing a revenue neutral carbon tax. I think that I support getting rid of the subsidies. We have what's been subsidized and what hasn't gets more complicated. So if you're looking at, depletion allowance for oil, it really depends on which developers you're talking about who's actually subsidized and who's instead just doing what every industry is allowed to do. In terms of some of the other things, there are some gains there, and the way we regulate utilities does not always provide a good incentive for increasing efficiency of energy use, and the industrial sector generally has far greater incentives to increase efficiency than other sectors. All that said, when you look under the hood of various types of efficiency requirements, they tend not to produce the gains we expect. But even if we accept all that, right, even if we say, okay, fine, we're still going to do what we can, that doesn't get us where we need to go. It doesn't get us to 80% by 2050 in the United States, let alone create the technologies that we need for the rest of the world to have anything approaching the availability of energy that we have in a low carbon way. So, I'm all in favor of taking advantage of all the low-hanging fruit that are out there. I'm all in favor of getting rid of all the various distorting energy subsidies that benefit fossil fuels that we have. I think you could leave a lot of the renewable energy subsidies we have in place. That's not going to do it. I mean, if we're serious about stabilizing carbon in the atmosphere, we need to be thinking far more aggressively about not what technologies we're going to have a year from now, 5 years from now, what technologies are we going to have 20 years from now. Because if we don't focus on that, we'll reduce sea level rise by ½ inch. We'll reduce the increase in temperature over the next 100 years by a degree or two. And that's not what we're aiming for. Right? So we really need to be realizing what our ultimate goal is. And if that's the case, we need to be thinking far more about innovation than we do, because that's really the only way to do it. And again, you can unpack the wedge studies, you can unpack all the various studies that are out there. We never get away from the fact that if we don't figure out how to have far greater innovation than we have, we can't stabilize atmospheric carbon without some kind of geoengineering experiment that my guess is most people in this room don't really feel great about. I know I certainly don't feel great about.
I just want to add one thing to this. I think it's maybe it doesn't bring us right away there, but I believe it's a really good step towards it because there are good examples already there. In Germany, I think every 6 manufacturer has cell generation, and I think the step after that is looking at distributed generation and the smart grid overall. And I believe that pushing for efficiency standard is a good way to push toward this way, and that's, I think, again, the interim step to the broader innovation.
Yeah, I'm sensitive to the idea that, we've subsidized fossil fuels in the past, and therefore, why don't we cut a break to the renewables going forward? But I think that that's, Michael Boskin once told me, one of Ronald Reagan's economics advisors told me, make sure when you're talking about this to talk about the marginal harm caused by the next ton of CO2 emitted. Don't go back in some sort of legacy calculation, because you go back into legacy calculation, you're not getting efficient allocations now. You're sort of doing some equity from the past. So, and that's Michael Boskin. That's a sophisticated economist. Now, my mom used to tell me this. She would say, Bob, if you hadn't done such and so, we wouldn't be here right now. And I'd say, I know that, Mom. What do we do now? And so we know, like Mom, we did some things in the past, but okay, now what do we do now? That's Michael Boskin sort of taken to a different level.
I'm sorry to extend this, but so in a local example, there's $330 million that are going to be poured into a new road from University Circle to I-490, the Opportunity Corridor. That is going to be a new road. It's going to be inducing more carbon emissions. And we have a fix-it-first policy on the books in Ohio, which says that we're going to maintain before we build new. And if you drive through these neighborhoods, you'll notice very quickly when you're trying to dodge craters that, there's no such thing as actual fix-it-first policy. My question is if we're actually allowed to decarbonize. If we're allowed, and I really, I'm not even talking about in the past. I'm really stressing to everybody, my question is, how do we stop subsidizing fossils now? Not just at the source, but in terms of demand. We're demanding that people utilize these resources.
We're going to lose our lease on the room, but let me say very quickly that there certainly is a lot of work to be done to look at the way various regulations and institutions and legal and laws inhibit things that would make a lot more sense to do. And that's certainly an area we don't spend nearly enough time looking at.
Raise your hand if my notepad with names and emails is by you.
Right here.
Wonderful. Please join me in thanking our panel.